This is important, so pay attention. If you're serious about learning photography the right way, then this video is going to be one of the most important videos you will ever see. So pay attention. This is not going to be the most exciting video, but what I'm going to explain in this video is the foundation to all photography. So if you're serious about learning to shoot in manual, then pay attention. And yes, I clipped my mic to a letter opener. Now, if you're serious about learning to shoot in manual mode and ditching auto modes in photography, you have to understand this. This here is the exposure triangle, and it is the foundation of everything photography. Every photo you will ever take is a balancing act or a combination of all three of these things. So pay attention. Now, first up, we have aperture. Now, aperture refers specifically to the opening in your lens that allows light to come through. This is one way of controlling your exposure. So, how does aperture work? Well, let me lay it out for you this way. Aperture is usually laid out in a series of numbers. In fact, you can see, at least I hope you can see, some of those numbers here on my lens. An aperture goes from a low number to a high number. So for example, we have 1.4 here and maybe 22 over here, and everything in between you have like 1.4, 2.8, 4.0, 5.6, 8, 11, 16, etc. Well, some lenses have more numbers than this, some have less, but you get the idea. How this works is you control your exposure via your aperture, essentially by picking a number. And the way this works is counterintuitive. A lot of people think that if you go down, meaning you have a smaller number, your exposure is darker, but that's not actually the case. The way aperture works, the smaller the number, the more wide open your aperture is. For example, this lens here, this is a 50mm f1.4 lens. So starting down here on our little aperture scale, this is f1.4, this is 2.0, 2.8, f4, I believe that's 5.6, etc. So the smaller the number, the more wide open your aperture, meaning more light comes through your lens and hits your sensor, which then means your exposure is higher. And the inverse is true also. The larger the number, the smaller your opening is, and the less light comes through, therefore making your image or your exposure darker. So it can be illustrated like this. Again, small number, bright, bigger number, dark. And you control your exposure with the aperture specifically by essentially picking a number or picking anything in this range, depending on how bright or dark you want your exposure to be. But that is only one part of what aperture does. Aperture also affects this little thing called depth of field. You'll have to excuse my crappy drawing skills, but imagine that it can be illustrated like this. You have your camera here, then you have a person, and then you have trees, maybe behind that person, and then way off in the distance you have the mountains. If you are shooting a portrait, meaning you're taking pictures of people, and you want to have the background blurry like you see in so many portraits online, that is done using a shallow depth of field, which is at the open end of the aperture spectrum, so small numbers. Shallow depth of field means there is only a small slice. Let's say, for example, this person's head. Imagine this being in 3D space front to back. So there's only a small slice of your image in focus. In this case, it would be this person's face. This would be at f1.4. But let's say instead you want everything in focus. You want to be able to take a picture that shows people, it shows the trees behind them, and it shows the really crappy mountains back here. This is taken using a deep depth of field. Again, in 3D space, Shallow depth of field is this. Deep depth of field is this. So if you want a deep depth of field, that is over on the other end of the aperture spectrum, here, where the high numbers are at. So if you want everything in focus, you want from here all the way to back here, you use a much higher number. Now, depending on how far away stuff is, you don't have to use the highest number. You can use a smaller number. Like, let's say this is f11, which is a perfectly reasonable aperture for a deep depth of field, and I use it all the time in my landscape photography work. So, small number, bright exposure, and shallow depth of field. Large number, darker exposure, and just imagine, if you will, deeper depth of field. Balancing these two things, how bright your image is and how much of your image is in focus, is what the aperture is for. Moving on to shutter speed. After the light comes through your camera lens, it hits the shutter. The shutter blocks light from hitting your sensor or your film, if you're shooting film, until you're ready to take the shot. However, your shutter goes at different speeds. So let's say over here is like 1 second, and then over here is 1/1000th of a second. And there's all these different shutter speeds in between. There's like half a second here, and maybe 1/60th of a second here, 100th here, 200, 400, 500, 800 here. You get the idea. It's also a range. Now, like aperture, this functions based on the numbers, but this works a lot more how you think. The smaller the number, the brighter your exposure is going to be. The larger the number, the darker your exposure is going to be. The reason this is like this is because the higher the number, the faster your shutter will actuate to expose your sensor to light. And the less time there is for light to hit your sensor, the darker your exposure is going to be. So faster is darker and slower is brighter. But there is another effect here. This thing called motion blur. Now, with motion blur, if anything in your scene is in motion, let's say somebody is running. If your shutter is slow and he is moving, there is more time where the shutter is exposed to light, but it also records that motion over time in your image, thereby resulting in motion blur. He is not sharp. You're gonna be seeing streaking, and it's gonna look blurry and gross. But if you have a faster shutter speed, and again, the same guy over here is running. If you have a faster shutter speed, that motion will be frozen and it will be crisp and clear. So, shutter speed affects two things. Your exposure, because it affects how much time light is hitting the sensor. So, a slower shutter speed is a brighter image, and a faster shutter speed is a darker image. But it also affects motion blur. A slower shutter equals more motion blur, and a faster shutter is less motion blur, or if it's fast enough, which most cameras will go far past 1/1000th of a second, no motion blur at all. So, balancing these two things can also affect your image. It affects your exposure, just like aperture does, but it also affects motion blur. It's got two effects. Now we come to the third part of the exposure triangle, which is ISO. Now, back in film days, you would buy film stock and it would have a set ISO. It would be like 200 or 400, 800. Sometimes you'd see 1600, but it was pretty rare. The ISO speed, it was also known as ASA, that speed, which is what they called it, would affect how sensitive the film was to light. So the higher the number, the more sensitive the film was to light. The lower the number, the darker it was. In digital cameras, this works very much the same way. However, it is not increasing the sensor's sensitivity to light, it is simply amplifying the signal that the sensor is putting out to your camera's processor, therefore making the image brighter. Nerd speak aside, this works exactly how you think it does. Lower number, darker, higher number, brighter. And you pick, once again, by selecting a range. However, just like the other two, there is a secondary effect. The higher you push your ISO, you will get more noise in your image. This will look like kind of a grainy, sort of like messy texture when you zoom in to your images. And if you push the ISO really high, it can start to kind of blur out and mess up detail because there's so much noise. Another name for this is grain. Now, the higher your ISO, the brighter your image, but the more grain you will get. The lower your ISO, the darker your image will be, but the less noise you will get. So, all three of these things here is the foundation of photography. You have aperture, also referred to as f-stop, which controls how much light comes in through your lens and how much of your image you have in focus. You have shutter, which controls how long light is allowed to hit your sensor, which affects your exposure, but also affects whether things in motion in your shot are blurry or not. And you have ISO, which essentially is a direct control of how bright or dark your image is. You just have to be careful if you don't want lots of grain in your photo. All three of these things put together make up the exposure triangle, which is the foundation of all photography. So taking a photo is striking a balancing act of all three of these things. And there is not one setting that works in every situation. Every situation that you come across in photography is going to require different combinations of these settings. There's not just one setting for each of these that you can set and then never touch it again. That's not how it works. Every scenario you come across, every situation you want to photograph is going to be some different combination of all of these things. Like maybe, for example, you are shooting a sports game, so you need a fast shutter speed. So you're way heavy over here into the shutter speed. You're at like 1/4000th of a second or something crazy. As a result, your shutter speed's really, really high. Your image is going to be dark. And so you're like, okay, what do I do? You have two options. You can open your aperture to let in more light, which would reduce your depth of field, or you can raise the ISO to amplify the signal that your sensor is sending to your processor and make your image brighter. If you want to make sure you have subjects in focus, you can't go too open on your aperture. So let's say maybe you stop it down a little bit to like f4 right here, and you're still too dark. Let's say you're at ISO 200. You're still too dark. You pump it up to 800 here, and now you have a proper exposure. This has you really heavy on the shutter speed, a little bit lighter on the ISO, a little bit lighter on the aperture. And those three things combine to give you a proper exposure. So every scenario you come across and try to photograph is going to be some different combination of each of these things. But if you practice and you master this, it will eventually get to the point where it's second nature and you can look at a scenario and just instinctively know what settings you need to use. But doing that comes with a lot of trial and error. So if you are serious about shooting in full manual, you need to memorize and practice this. Practice this over and over and over again. Take your camera with you everywhere, shoot everything, and the more you do it, the easier this will become.
You now have a solid understanding of the basics of shooting in manual. Everything I've just taught you in this video is the foundation of all photography. Doesn't matter what camera you're shooting with, doesn't matter what lens setup you have, doesn't matter if it's digital or film. This is foundational information that applies across the board. But it will only do you good if you go out and actually apply it. So don't just watch this video and then move on to the next. Go out, pick up your camera, find something that interests you, be that, people, a landscape, architecture, whatever, and go actually put this into practice. Don't put your camera in auto, leave it in manual, and go actually practice everything I've showed you here. And if you post on Instagram, I'd love to see your work, so tag me at Paul_Stropel, and I'd love to check it out. Maybe critique a little bit if you're open to that. So pick up your camera, go out and practice, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.